Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The unexpected cry. The atmosphere aboard Flight 457 was typical for a transatlantic journey, subdued, routine, and monotonous. The hum of the jet engines served as background music for the various scenes playing out across the cabin. Rows of passengers were either nodding off, engrossed in the glow of their entertainment screens, or reading magazines with indifferent expressions. It was that liminal period in a long-haul flight when time seemed to stretch endlessly, and the destination felt both tantalizingly close and unbearably far. Among the cabin crew, Sarah Chun moved with practiced efficiency, her years of experience as a flight attendant evident in her graceful yet purposeful stride. She had been in this job long enough to anticipate passenger needs before they arose. That night, as she collected empty cups and discarded napkins from passengers who had just finished their meals, she caught snippets of quiet conversations and the occasional burst of laughter. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Until she heard the cry. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the hum of the engines. Sarah paused, her trained ears catching the sound over the din of the cabin. It wasn't the cry of a fussy child or the groan of a disgruntled passenger. It carried a distinct urgency, sharp, raw, and unmistakably filled with pain. She turned toward the rear of the plane, her eyes scanning for the source. The sound came again, louder this time, and it seemed to emanate from the direction of the restroom. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with her colleague, Mike, who was busy stacking used meal trays. His eyebrows furrowed as he met her gaze. Over the years, they had developed a sort of unspoken communication, and the look on Sarah's face was enough to prompt him to nod silently. Without a word, she handed him the remaining trash bag and headed down the aisle. The cry came again just as Sarah reached the door to the restroom. She knocked lightly, her heart beginning to race. "Hello? Is everything okay in there?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. For a moment, there was no response, only the sound of labored breathing. Then, a muffled voice replied, shaky and weak, I think something's wrong." Sarah's instincts flared. She pressed her ear closer to the door, trying to gauge the situation. "Ma'am, can you open the door for me? I'm here to help." A click followed, and the door creaked open, just enough for Sarah to see a young woman leaning heavily against the tiny sink. Her face was pale, and beads of sweat glistened on her forehead. She looked no older than 25, and her eyes were wide with fear. Her hand clutched her rounded belly. "I think the baby's coming," the woman gasped, her voice trembling as she struggled to steady herself. For a brief moment, Sarah froze. This was not in the list of routine mid-flight issues she had prepared for during training. But her training kicked in nonetheless, overriding her initial panic. She slipped into the cramped restroom and gently supported the woman as she guided her to sit on the closed toilet seat. "All right, we're going to take care of you," Sarah said firmly, her voice steady, despite the chaos brewing inside her mind. She pressed the intercom button near the sink and spoke quickly into it. "Mike, I need you to make an announcement. We have a medical emergency. If there's a doctor or medical professional on board, please ask them to come to the back of the cabin immediately." Within moments, Mike's calm voice echoed through the plane, breaking the usual monotony of the flight. Passengers stirred in their seats, curiosity and concern replacing their drowsy expressions. Sarah remained focused on the young woman, who clutched her belly with one hand and gripped Sarah's arm with the other. "My name is Sarah," she said softly. "What's your name?" "Amara," the woman replied between labored breaths. "All right, Amara. How far along are you?" I don't know exactly. Maybe 7 months? 8? Amara winced as another contraction gripped her body, her knuckles whitening as she held on to Sarah. Sarah's heart sank. A premature labor at 30,000 feet was far from ideal. She had handled medical situations before, minor injuries, panic attacks, even a heart attack once, but this was uncharted territory. Still, she couldn't afford to let her anxiety show. Amara needed her to stay calm. A middle-aged man in a navy blue sweater approached, his face lined with concern but radiating confidence. "I'm Dr. Patel," he introduced himself. "I heard the announcement. How can I help?" Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you for coming, Doctor. Amara here is in labor. We need to assess the situation quickly." Dr. Patel nodded and stepped into the tiny restroom, his demeanor professional and reassuring. He knelt beside Amara and began asking her a series of questions while Sarah stepped out to give them space. Outside, Mike was managing the growing curiosity among the passengers, assuring them that the situation was under control. "Sarah," Mike said quietly as she emerged, "the captain's been informed. He's considering an emergency landing if necessary." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. An emergency landing was a last resort, given the logistical challenges it posed. But if Amara's condition worsened, it might be their only option. Back inside the restroom, Dr. Patel's voice was calm but firm. "Sarah, we need to prepare for the possibility of delivering this baby here and now. The contractions are coming fast, and there's no time to delay." Sarah's stomach clenched, but she nodded. "What do you need?" "Gloves, towels, warm water if possible," he said. "And we'll need to create some privacy." Sarah sprang into action, enlisting the help of another flight attendant to gather supplies. They quickly erected a makeshift privacy barrier using blankets and scarves, shielding the rear of the plane from view. Passengers watched with wide eyes, their murmurs filling the cabin like a rising tide. "Amara," Sarah said gently as she returned with the supplies, "we're going to help you through this. You're not alone." Amara's eyes brimmed with tears, a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Dr. Patel worked methodically, his calm presence a balm to the tension in the air. Sarah stayed by Amara's side, holding her hand and offering words of encouragement as the contractions grew more intense. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, every sound and movement amplified in the confined space. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a sharp cry pierced the air, a sound so pure and powerful that it seemed to silence everything else. Amara sobbed with relief as Dr. Patel held up a tiny, squirming baby, its lungs announcing its arrival to the world. "It's a boy," Dr. Patel said, his voice tinged with awe as he handed the baby to Amara. The cabin erupted in applause, the passengers unable to contain their emotions. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Amara cradle her son, her exhaustion giving way to pure joy. But as Sarah looked at the tiny newborn, a strange unease settled in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but something about this moment felt like the beginning of a story far more complex than anyone could have anticipated. Little did anyone know, the events of that night would set off a chain of revelations that would shake Amara's world to its core. Whispers in the sky. The tension from the birth had slowly dissipated into a wave of awe and admiration. Passengers settled back into their seats, whispering among themselves about the miraculous event. Flight 457, once a mundane trip across the Atlantic, was now part of a story no one aboard would ever forget. For Sarah Chun, though, the adrenaline had barely subsided. She stood near the makeshift privacy barrier, staring at Amara and the newborn wrapped snugly in a warm blanket. Amara's face was a mix of exhaustion and contentment as she cradled her son. The baby's cries had softened into quiet coos, his tiny fingers curling into fists. Sarah couldn't help but smile, despite her earlier unease. Dr. Patel was nearby, monitoring both mother and baby, his professional calm still in place as he checked Amara's pulse. "You did wonderfully, Amara," Sarah said softly, crouching beside her. "You're so strong." Amara looked up, her tired eyes glistening. "Thank you, all of you. I couldn't have done this alone." "You're never alone here," Sarah reassured her. "But how are you feeling now?" "Better," Amara replied. Her voice was weak but steady. "Just tired." Dr. Patel looked up from his notes. "She'll need rest and fluids, but the baby is healthy, thank goodness." "Premature, yes, but strong." Relief swept over Sarah. She glanced at Mike, who was still managing curious passengers. A small crowd had gathered at the front of the plane, passengers murmuring like an audience at a theater intermission. The miracle of new life had a way of connecting people, even strangers at 30,000 feet in the air. Yet even amid the celebration, Sarah's earlier unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Maybe it was the circumstances. A baby born mid-flight? It wasn't impossible, but it was rare. And Amara's expression, the tight grip on her emotions even in such a vulnerable moment, hinted at a deeper story. Sarah shook off her thoughts and stood, ready to resume her duties. Dr. Patel handed her a note with some instructions. Let the captain know the situation is stable for now. I'll stay with Amara for the remainder of the flight. Understood, Sarah replied. She straightened her uniform and stepped toward the cockpit to deliver the update. The captain, a stoic man named Captain Roberts, was relieved to hear the news, but warned they were monitoring weather patterns near the destination. We'll be landing in 4 hours. Let's hope for smooth skies. As the hours passed, the plane returned to a fragile sense of normalcy. Passengers trickled back into their routines, though most cast lingering glances toward the rear of the cabin where Amara rested. Whispers floated like dust motes through the air, curiosity, admiration, and speculation mixing together. I heard she wasn't even supposed to be flying, someone murmured near the window seat. Did you see the baby? So tiny, another passenger added. Sarah did her best to quiet these conversations as she moved down the aisle. While most passengers meant no harm, she knew how easily stories could spiral out of control. Amara deserved peace, not prying eyes and rumors. She stopped at the back to check in again. Amara was awake, though her eyelids hung heavy with fatigue. The baby was nestled in her arms, sleeping soundly. Dr. Patel had fashioned a makeshift bassinet from blankets and an airline supply box. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. Do you need anything? Sarah whispered. Amara shook her head weakly. I'm all right. I just wish this wasn't so public. Sarah's heart ached for her. People are just amazed by what happened. You're strong, Amara. And your son, he's a miracle. Amara smiled faintly but didn't reply. Sarah noticed the way Amara avoided her gaze, as though shielding something unsaid. Before she could ask, Mike approached from the aisle. Sarah, one of the passengers in row 12 wants to speak with you. Says it's important. Sarah frowned. Who is it? Some man. Didn't get his name. But he seems intense. In row 12, a middle-aged man sat stiffly, his dark suit immaculate despite the long flight. Sarah approached with a polite smile. Sir, I understand you needed assistance? The man looked up sharply, his gaze cold and calculating. Yes, I do. His voice was low but firm, carrying an edge that set Sarah on alert. The woman who gave birth, is she all right? Sarah blinked. I'm afraid I can't discuss personal details about passengers. The man's jaw tightened. That's unfortunate. I'm concerned for her well-being. Are you a relative? Sarah asked carefully. He hesitated, as though calculating his response. No. Just an interested party. The answer sent chills up Sarah's spine, but she forced herself to remain composed. I'm sorry, sir. If you're not a direct relation, I can't share information. He gave a curt nod, his eyes narrowing. Of course. I understand. As Sarah turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man's interest wasn't benign. She glanced back to see him staring intently at the rear of the plane, where Amara rested with her newborn. The final hours of the flight were uneventful on the surface, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Sarah couldn't ignore the strange man in row 12 or the gnawing feeling in her gut. Something about Amara's situation was off, like a puzzle with missing pieces. When the plane finally touched down, applause erupted from the passengers, though the moment felt hollow to Sarah. Paramedics and airport staff were already waiting on the tarmac, prepared to take Amara and her baby to the nearest hospital. Sarah assisted Amara off the plane, gently holding her arm for support. "You're going to be all right," Sarah assured her, smiling warmly. "They'll take care of you." Amara looked up at her, her expression conflicted. "Thank you, for everything." Sarah nodded, though her mind was racing. As the paramedics guided Amara onto a waiting stretcher, Sarah caught a glimpse of the man from row 12 standing just beyond the security line, his eyes fixed on Amara. Something wasn't right. Hours later, after the flight crew had debriefed and dispersed, Sarah sat in the staff lounge of the airline's headquarters, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Amara and the strange events of the flight. The birth had been a miracle, but the questions surrounding it wouldn't leave her mind. Who was Amara? Why had she been flying so close to her due date? And why did that man in row 12 seem so invested in her? Sarah's phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Mike. "You won't believe this. Amara's name isn't showing up in the passenger manifest." Sarah stared at the screen, her heartbeat quickening. That wasn't possible. She had been there. She had held Amara's hand. She had seen the baby born with her own eyes. But if Amara wasn't on the manifest, then who was she? And how had she ended up on Flight 457? As the questions mounted, Sarah realized that the story she had become part of wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The hidden passenger. The sterile hum of the airline staff lounge did little to calm Sarah's frayed nerves. She sat hunched over her phone, Mike's cryptic message still glowing on the screen. "You won't believe this. Amara's name isn't showing up in the passenger manifest." How could that be possible? She was on the flight, Sarah had held her hand, witnessed her giving birth, and seen her leave with the newborn in her arms. The chaos of the mid-flight delivery had distracted everyone, but now, hours later, inconsistencies were beginning to surface like wreckage rising from the ocean depths. Sarah took a deep breath and stood. There was no use spiraling into panic yet. She needed facts. She exited the lounge and headed straight for the operations desk, where Mike was waiting for her. He looked just as unsettled, his usually relaxed demeanor replaced with a pinched expression. "I double-checked," Mike said as soon as Sarah approached. "I checked the passenger manifest, the ticket logs, everything. There's no Amara listed anywhere on Flight 457. The seat she was in? It was marked as empty." Sarah frowned, processing the information. "That's impossible. You saw her, Mike. You helped me put up the privacy barrier. We all saw her." Mike nodded. "Exactly. But for whatever reason, the system doesn't have her name or a record of her boarding. It's like she was never there." Sarah leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "What about her baby? Did the paramedics say anything after they took her off the plane?" Mike hesitated. "That's the other thing. I overheard one of the paramedics talking to the hospital staff when they arrived. They were concerned because Amara didn't have any identification. No ID, no passport, nothing." Sarah froze. "So how did she get on the flight?" "That's the million-dollar question," Mike replied grimly. The mystery gnawed at Sarah as she left the airport later that evening. The exhaustion of the long-haul flight, combined with the bizarre events of the past 24 hours, weighed heavily on her. Amara's face haunted her thoughts, the mixture of relief and terror as she cradled her newborn, the furtive way she avoided questions, and now, the chilling fact that her presence on the flight was undocumented. Who was she running from? And why? Sarah spent the drive home replaying the details of the flight over and over. By the time she unlocked her apartment door, the night sky was ink black, and the streets were eerily quiet. The hum of the fridge in her kitchen seemed deafening as she dropped her bag and sank into the couch, rubbing her temples. "Think logically," she told herself. "What do I know? Amara boarded Flight 457 without documentation. She gave birth mid-flight, assisted by Dr. Patel. A man in row 12 showed unusual interest in her. Now, she had disappeared from the system entirely. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. There was a deeper story, and Amara's sudden appearance and disappearance was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, Sarah woke to a string of missed calls and text messages. Her phone buzzed in her palm as she checked the notifications. It was Mike. "Turn on the news. Now." Sarah's stomach flipped as she grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. The familiar logo of a national news network appeared, and the reporter's face filled the screen. The headline running across the bottom sent chills down her spine. "Newborn baby found at hospital, mother's identity unknown." The camera cut to a reporter standing outside a hospital entrance. She spoke quickly, her tone urgent. "The mother, identified only as Jane Doe, was brought here late last night after giving birth mid-flight. Authorities say the woman arrived without any identification or belongings, and she has since disappeared from the hospital, leaving her baby behind." Sarah sank onto the edge of the couch, the reporter's words echoing in her mind. "She's gone." Amara had vanished, leaving behind the newborn she had fought so hard to deliver. The broadcast continued, showing footage of the baby swaddled in blankets, sleeping peacefully in a hospital bassinet. Doctors assured the media that the infant was healthy, despite being premature. But the bigger question loomed: who was the baby's mother? And where had she gone? Sarah's phone rang again, pulling her from her daze. It was Mike. "Did you see it?" he asked without preamble. "I saw it," Sarah whispered. "She left the baby behind." "Something isn't right about this," Mike said, his voice tight. "I don't know what kind of mess we've been pulled into, but this isn't over." Determined to find answers, Sarah spent the day making discreet inquiries. She started with airport security, using her connections to review surveillance footage from the boarding gate. Hours later, sitting in a dimly lit office with one of the security officers, Sarah watched the grainy footage from Flight 457's boarding. "Play it back," Sarah said, her voice tense. The officer rewound the footage and hit play. Passenger after passenger filed onto the plane, each one scanned by the boarding agent. Sarah squinted at the screen, waiting to see Amara. The seconds ticked by. Then, finally, a woman appeared who matched Amara's description, a slight figure in a dark hoodie, her face obscured. "That's her," Sarah said, pointing. The officer paused the video and frowned. "That's odd." "What is it?" "There's no record of her boarding at this point," the officer said. "See? She's not scanned. She slips through." Sarah's pulse quickened. "So she snuck onto the flight?" "It looks that way. But here's the thing, no alarms went off. The system didn't register a breach." Sarah stared at the screen, chills crawling down her spine. "How is that possible?" The officer shook his head. "That's what we'd all like to know." Later that night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her. She scribbled down everything she knew about Amara, trying to piece together the puzzle. Boarded flight without being scanned. No ID or passport. Gave birth mid-flight. Disappeared from the hospital. Man in row 12 showed unusual interest. That man. Sarah's pen paused. Something about him had been off from the moment she spoke to him. Why had he asked about Amara? And what did he mean when he called himself an interested party? Sarah flipped open her laptop and began searching for any news related to missing persons or fugitives. Hours passed, the glow of the screen illuminating her tired face. Finally, she stumbled across a story that made her blood run cold. Human trafficking ring suspect at large, authorities believe key witness may be missing. The article mentioned an international trafficking ring under investigation and described a young woman who had escaped just days earlier. She was thought to be in hiding, a critical witness who could unravel the entire operation. The description matched Amara perfectly. Sarah sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. Amara hadn't just been running, she had been fleeing. Someone was after her, and the baby's birth had forced her hand. But where was Amara now? And who was the man in row 12? The realization hit Sarah like a freight train. The birth of Amara's child had not been an accident. It was a flashpoint, a moment that had set something dangerous into motion. And Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the next move, whatever it was coming soon. Shadows of the truth. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat slumped at her dining table, surrounded by scattered papers and notes she'd scribbled through the early hours. Amara's face lingered in her thoughts, her desperate yet quiet demeanor haunting Sarah. The more she uncovered, the more the reality became chilling. Amara was running for her life, and now she had vanished, leaving behind her newborn. But why? And where could she have gone? The laptop screen in front of Sarah had long gone dark when a message notification broke the silence. She jerked awake, disoriented, and grabbed her phone. It was Mike again. "Mike, you need to see this. Meet me at the airline office. Bring your ID." Sarah didn't waste a moment. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her thoughts spinning like a cyclone. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when she pulled into the airport parking lot. Mike was waiting for her at the operations center, his face pale and lined with fatigue. "You look like hell," Sarah muttered, trying to lighten the mood. "Trust me, I've earned it," Mike replied. "Come on. You're not gonna believe this." He led her inside, bypassing the usual security points with his ID badge. They entered a small conference room where an IT technician sat in front of a monitor, fingers tapping away. When he saw Sarah, he nodded. "I'm glad you're here. Mike told me everything," the technician said. "We found something strange while reviewing the flight logs. You need to see it for yourself." The technician pulled up a screen showing encrypted logs from Flight 457 systems. "Every flight records data on passengers, crew, and movements for safety purposes," he explained. "It's all tracked and stored. But here's the thing, something's missing." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, leaning in closer. The technician zoomed in on the boarding log, showing a gap in the sequence of scanned tickets. Amara, or whoever she is, bypassed the system entirely. Her appearance doesn't just not show up, it's like a deliberate erasure. Someone tampered with this data before the flight even took off. Sarah frowned, struggling to process what she was hearing. "Are you saying someone helped her get on the plane?" "Exactly," the technician confirmed. "This wasn't random. Someone with access to the system cleared her path. It's like she had an invisible ticket." Mike crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "It gets worse. We checked the manifest for every flight in the last week leaving from the same gate." The technician clicked a few keys, pulling up another list. "We found another name linked to an earlier flight, also missing from records. But this time, the name was flagged as suspicious by Interpol." Sarah's eyes widened. "Interpol?" The technician nodded. "A human trafficking suspect, a known middleman in an international ring. He boarded a flight out of this same gate 3 days before your flight and vanished in another country. Authorities are looking for him." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Are you saying Amara could be tied to that?" "It's a possibility," the technician said carefully. "If she's a witness, or worse, a victim, then the people running this operation would do anything to silence her." Sarah sank into a chair, her thoughts spinning wildly. She thought of Amara's trembling voice, the sheer terror in her eyes during the delivery. She wasn't just a mother running from an unknown danger, she was fleeing monsters who would stop at nothing to find her. The man from row 12 came rushing back to Sarah's mind. "What about that passenger?" she blurted. "The man in row 12. He knew something. He was watching her. He told me he was an interested party." Mike exchanged a look with the technician. "We pulled his details, too," Mike said. "His name's fake. No ID checks flagged him because his documentation looked legit. But the authorities are investigating now. Sarah, whoever this guy is, he's dangerous." Sarah felt the air in her lungs tighten. It was all connected, the missing names, the erased logs, and Amara's escape. She was being hunted, and her only escape had been that flight, no matter how dangerous it was to board in her condition. And now she was gone. "We need to help her," Sarah said suddenly, her voice steely. "We can't just let this drop." Mike hesitated. "Sarah, this is bigger than us. If she's mixed up with traffickers, the authorities need to handle it. This isn't a game." "It's not a game, Mike," Sarah shot back. "She trusted us. She trusted me. If I don't do something, that baby could grow up never knowing the truth. And Amara could," she trailed off, unable to voice the worst-case scenario. Over the next few hours, Sarah pieced together what little information she had. She called contacts at the hospital where Amara had been taken, but the nurses had no leads. "She was gone when we checked on her," one nurse told Sarah. "It's like she vanished." Frustrated, Sarah turned her attention to the authorities handling the case. After hours of pleading, she was able to get a short phone call with a detective investigating the trafficking network. "Ms. Chun, I understand you want to help," the detective said, his voice weary. "But these people don't play by the rules. If Amara is who we think she is, a witness or an escapee, then she's in immense danger. She's running because staying in one place could mean her death." "But what about her baby?" Sarah pressed. "She left him behind." "That doesn't make sense." The detective sighed. It might have been a calculated decision. These traffickers target children to force mothers back into their grasp. By leaving the baby, she's protecting him, even if it means sacrificing herself. The words hit Sarah like a fist to the chest. Amara's sacrifice, her quiet, desperate strength, was clearer now than ever. She hadn't abandoned her baby out of carelessness. She had made the hardest choice a mother could make, to keep him safe, by putting distance between them. "But where is she now?" Sarah asked softly. The detective's answer was grim. "We're doing everything we can to find her before they do. But I'll be honest, it's a race against time." That evening, Sarah sat quietly in her apartment, staring out at the city skyline. Her thoughts were consumed by Amara and the baby, two lives that had crossed her path in the most extraordinary way. In a way, the baby represented hope, a chance to escape the darkness Amara had fled. Her phone buzzed again. It was another text from Mike. "Mike, they ID'd the guy from row 12. He's not working alone. Watch your back, Sarah." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She looked out the window, a shadow of paranoia creeping in. Whoever was after Amara was dangerous enough to tamper with airline records and follow her across countries. And now, Sarah realized, they might know who she was, too. Late that night, as rain tapped against her window, Sarah made a promise to herself. No matter how dangerous the situation became, she would not let Amara's story vanish into oblivion. She would fight to protect the baby, to uncover the truth, and to bring justice to Amara, wherever she was. Because somewhere out there, a young mother was running for her life. And if Sarah had anything to say about it, Amara would not have to run forever. But deep down, Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The shadows of the truth had only just begun to reveal themselves, and darker forces were closing in. The last flight. The next few days unfolded in a blur. Sarah's world became consumed by Amara's story, a story she couldn't shake, a story she now felt responsible for helping resolve. She moved like a ghost through her shifts, always checking her back, her heart pounding whenever she saw someone unfamiliar lingering too long in the terminal or the airline office. The warning Mike had given her about the man from row 12 haunted her. These people didn't work alone. If they had the resources to infiltrate airline systems and erase records, they were far more dangerous than Sarah had initially realized. And now, by digging deeper, she had placed herself on their radar. But Sarah refused to stop. Amara's baby was safe, but the mother wasn't. And as days turned into weeks, there was still no trace of her. One evening, as Sarah returned to her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from Mike. "Mike, you need to come to the office. Now." Something big just happened. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and keys, her nerves on edge as she sped back to the airline's operations center. When she entered the building, Mike was waiting for her in a quiet conference room, along with two other people, Detective Alvarez, the lead investigator on Amara's case, and a woman Sarah didn't recognize. "Sarah, sit," Mike said, his tone serious. The woman spoke first. "I'm Dr. Carmen Lewis. I work with Interpol on trafficking cases." Sarah's breath caught. "Interpol?" "Yes," Dr. Lewis continued. "You've been instrumental in piecing together events from Flight 457. Because of you, we now have leads that may help us track Amara. And potentially, dismantle part of the trafficking network pursuing her." Sarah's mind raced. "You found her?" Dr. Lewis shook her head. "Not yet. But we intercepted communication that indicated the traffickers are aware Amara escaped, and that they're closing in. We believe she may be trying to flee again, this time on foot, across international borders." Sarah's heart sank. "She's still running." "Yes," Alvarez interjected. "But here's where it gets strange. She's not alone. We believe she may have had outside help, someone on the inside." "The inside?" Sarah repeated. Dr. Lewis nodded. "A whistleblower. Someone who helped her board your flight without documentation and tampered with the logs. If we can find this person, we can find Amara. The problem is, we're running out of time. The traffickers are relentless. If they catch up to her first." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah already knew how that story would end. That night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Amara. She imagined the young mother on the run, carrying nothing but the weight of survival and the memories of the child she'd left behind. Sarah understood why Amara had disappeared, why she had no choice but to sacrifice her presence to keep her baby safe. But there was more to the story, and Sarah knew it. If Amara had outside help, there was a chance she could be found before the traffickers reached her. Sarah just needed to figure out who that help was. And she had a hunch. Sarah dug into the flight records again, reviewing crew and passenger details from Flight 457. Her instincts drew her back to the man in row 12, the one who had claimed to be an interested party. She cross-referenced his fake credentials with flagged identities from Interpol's database. This time, she got a hit. The man's fake name was tied to another flight a month earlier, one that had reportedly carried a trafficking victim across international lines. His presence wasn't coincidence. He was tracking Amara. The following morning, Sarah called Detective Alvarez. "I know how to find Amara," she said, her voice steady, despite her fear. "What do you mean?" Alvarez asked. "The man from row 12. He's not just following her, he's a handler. If he's involved in the network, then he's the link to finding her. He'll move again, and when he does, we follow." Alvarez hesitated. "You realize how dangerous this is, right?" "I do," Sarah replied. "But I also know I'm the only one who's seen this through from the start. Amara trusted me once. I won't abandon her now." Over the next 48 hours, Sarah worked closely with Alvarez and Dr. Lewis. Interpol surveillance teams monitored the man from row 12, watching his movements carefully. Sarah stayed involved, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the bond she'd formed with Amara during the most vulnerable moment of her life. Finally, the break came. The handler booked a last-minute flight to Eastern Europe, a region known for underground trafficking networks. "We think he's on his way to intercept Amara," Alvarez told Sarah. "Our team will follow him." "You've done enough, Sarah." But Sarah shook her head. "No. I'm coming." "You're not trained for this," Dr. Lewis argued. "I don't care," Sarah replied. "I have to see this through." The final flight Sarah boarded wasn't as a flight attendant. She sat in a window seat as a passenger, her heart pounding as the plane climbed into the sky. Alvarez and his team were on board, their presence blending seamlessly into the cabin. They were quiet, focused, their mission clear. By the time the flight landed, Sarah's nerves were frayed. The team trailed the handler through the crowded airport, Sarah following a safe distance behind. She watched as he slipped out of the terminal and into a nearby bus station. "We've got him," Alvarez whispered through an earpiece. For hours, they followed him through winding streets and small villages, the trail leading deeper into a rural area. Finally, at dusk, they arrived at a small, crumbling farmhouse. "She's here," Alvarez murmured. Sarah's pulse quickened. The team moved in quickly, securing the area and arresting the handler without resistance. Sarah waited outside the house, her breath shallow as the minutes dragged by. Then she heard a voice, soft, but familiar. "Sarah?" She turned, and there she was. Amara stood in the doorway, barefoot and exhausted, but alive. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the doorway for support. "You found me," Amara whispered. Sarah's throat tightened. "I promised I wouldn't stop looking." Amara broke down, collapsing into Sarah's arms. For the first time in weeks, the weight of fear and flight seemed to lift from her shoulders. "You're safe now," Sarah whispered, holding her tightly. "And so is your son." 2 weeks later, Amara was reunited with her baby under the protection of Interpol. The traffickers' network had been dealt a significant blow, and authorities assured Amara that she would receive full protection as both a witness and a survivor. Sarah stood in the hospital room, watching Amara cradle her son. "He's beautiful," Sarah said softly. Amara looked up, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Sarah. You gave me hope when I had none left." Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of the past month lift from her chest. "You're stronger than you know, Amara. You and your son, you're going to be okay." As she left the hospital, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She had stepped into a story she never expected to be part of, but in doing so, she had helped rewrite its ending. Flight 457 would always be remembered for the baby born mid-flight. But to Sarah, it would be remembered as the day she discovered the power of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. And as the sun set behind her, Sarah knew that miracles didn't just happen in the air, they happened in the spaces where humanity refused to give up.